What's up, cool people? I'm Matt Conroy. Welcome back to our Bible study. Alright, so Leviticus 4. Going to be talking about procedures for sin offerings, which is quite a bit more extensive than the previous offerings that were mentioned. But sin is kind of a big deal. So I guess it makes some sense. I guess I'll just kind of hop right into this then. Alrighty, Leviticus 4. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. This is how you are to deal with those who sin unintentionally by doing anything that violates one of the Lord's commands. If the high priest sins, bringing guilt upon the entire community, he must give a sin offering for the sin he has committed. He must present to the Lord a young bull with no defects. He must bring the bull to the Lord at the entrance of the tabernacle, lay his hand on the bull's head, and slaughter it before the Lord. The high priest will then take some of the bull's blood into the tabernacle, dip his finger in the blood, and sprinkle it 7 times before the Lord in front of the inner curtain of the sanctuary. The priest will then put some of the blood on the horns of the altar for fragrant incense that stands in the Lord's presence inside the tabernacle. He will pour out the rest of the bull's blood at the base of the altar for burnt offerings at the entrance of the tabernacle. Then the priest must remove all the fat of the bull to be offered as a sin offering. This includes all the fat around the internal organs, the 2 kidneys and the fat around them near the loins, and the long lobe of the liver. He must remove these along with the kidneys, just as he does with cattle offered as a peace offering, and burn them on the altar of burnt offerings. But he must take whatever is left of the bull, its hide, meat, head, legs, internal organs, and dung, and carry it away to a place outside the camp that is ceremonially clean, the place where the ashes are dumped. There on the ash heap he will burn it on a wood fire." Okay, so that last bit is definitely different from the previous ones. But let me get into footnotes here real quick. High priest, Hebrew says the anointed priest. But, I think that pretty much just assumes Aaron and then, whoever would take his place on down the line of succession. Basically, the main priest that is, in charge of all the priests. So it would make some sense to me that, the high priest's sin would be kind of a more significant thing because, he's supposed to represent God to the people, or at least, be sort of a go-between from the people to God and vice versa. And so, yeah, given that representation of God's will, the high priest sinning just sets a worse example relative to the entire community. Tabernacle footnote just probably says tent of meeting. Yep. And then there's So there's all this stuff going on with the bull's blood inside the tabernacle that didn't seem to apply to the other offerings, as well as kind of the burning of really most of the animal in a particular spot outside the camp. It kind of makes me wonder why the rest of the animal is going to a spot that is deemed ceremonially clean. Or maybe that's just to say, hey, this spot that's set aside for this particular purpose, do this thing there. Anyway, but I suppose, with the idea of sin offering, if you're doing that to make someone clean in God's eyes, then it would kind of make sense that the place itself is sort of considered ceremonially clean by that nature. But anyway, okay. I think I'm about ready to move on to the next part. So, verse 13. If the entire Israelite community sins by violating one of the Lord's commands, but the people don't realize it, they are still guilty. When they become aware of their sin, the people must bring a young bull as an offering for their sin and present it before the tabernacle. The elders of the community must then lay their hands on the bull's head and slaughter it before the Lord. The high priest will then take some of the bull's blood into the tabernacle, dip his finger in the blood, and sprinkle it 7 times before the Lord in front of the inner curtain. He will then put some of the blood on the horns of the altar for fragrant incense that stands in the Lord's presence inside the tabernacle. He will pour out the rest of the blood at the base of the altar for burnt offerings at the entrance of the tabernacle. Then the priest must remove all the animal's fat and burn it on the altar, just as he does with the bull offered as a sin offering for the high priest. Through this process, the priest will purify the people, making them right with the Lord, and they will be forgiven. Then the priest must take what is left of the bull and carry it outside the camp and burn it there, just as is done with the sin offering for the high priest. This offering is for the sin of the entire congregation of Israel. Okay, so this section is essentially establishing the idea that the sin of the high priest is of equivalent weight to sin of the entire community of Israel, because both mention only one young bull and all the procedures are the same. So, but I mean, it mentions in the part for the high priest, if the high priest sins, bringing guilt upon the entire community. So, by that token and that description, it means, those are equal. So they require equal sacrifice. Footnote here will make atonement for the people rather than making them right with the Lord. So, it's probably just another possible translation of the Hebrew saying to make atonement for instead of making them right with the Lord. But both of those phrases mean very similar things. And it also seems to be... I just realized, that this footnote, and probably a bunch of the others, mentioned certain other spots where, this particular phrase might come up where there's also this possible alternate, wording that could be used for it. Moving on to verse 22. If one of Israel's leaders sins by violating one of the commands of the Lord his God, but doesn't realize it, he is still guilty. When he becomes aware of his sin, he must bring as his offering a male goat with no defects. He must lay his hand on the goat's head and slaughter it at the place where burnt offerings are slaughtered before the Lord. This is an offering for his sin. Then the priest will dip his finger in the blood of the sin offering and put it on the horns of the altar for burnt offerings. He will pour out the rest of the blood at the base of the altar. Then he must burn all the goat's fat on the altar, just as he does with the peace offering. Through this process, the priest will purify the leader from his sin, making him right with the Lord, and he will be forgiven. Okay, so if it's one of the leaders, it's a little bit different. So they offer a goat, a male goat, instead of a young bull. They don't sprinkle the goat's blood on the They don't sprinkle it, quote, 7 times before the Lord in front of the inner curtain. That part doesn't happen with a sin offering for one of the leaders. They just put some of the blood on the horns of the altar and then dump the rest out. Pour the rest out at the base of the altar. Trying to see, now I'm looking for comparisons just to see what's similar and what's different. Yeah. So that's, the pouring out is the same. The putting it on the horns is the same. Burning all the fat on the altar is the same. But it doesn't mention burning the rest of the animal like it did for the other 2 things prior in the chapter. Because, this one's just for the leader. It's not like something that's supposed to be, cleansing or making atonement for the entire community. So, then we get to verse 27. If any of the common people sin by violating one of the Lord's commands, but they don't realize it, they are still guilty. When they become aware of their sin, they must bring as an offering for their sin a female goat with no defects. They must lay a hand on the head of the sin offering and slaughter it at the place where burnt offerings are slaughtered. Then the priest will dip his finger in the blood and put it on the horns of the altar for burnt offerings. He will pour out the rest of the blood at the base of the altar. Then he must remove all the goat's fat, just as he does with the fat of the peace offering. He will burn the fat on the altar, and it will make a pleasing aroma to the Lord. Through this process, the priest will purify the people, making them right with the Lord, and they will be forgiven. Okay, so difference this time is female goat instead of male, and pretty much everything else is the same. Except for, again, this one specifies the whole pleasing aroma phrase, which really makes me wonder about the original Hebrew and if there was a certain meaning to that, or like if there was a specific reason why some of the offerings were just kind of dedicated / assigned as pleasing aromas and not something else. Guess I'll move along, and then I think after I do the last one, I'll kind of go back and recap. Although, one thing I just remembered that I kind of want to say a little bit of something about. All of these have mentioned the people not realizing that they sinned. I wouldn't assume the process is any different for when they do realize it. It's just, they sin and they realized it right away. So they would just follow this process that much sooner. Or maybe there's a different thing. Again, I'm not one to make assumptions. Because, again, it specifies that they don't realize it. Maybe there's a reason it specifies that. Because the procedure would possibly be different if they did realize it. Just saying. Anyway, okay. Now I think I'll move on to verse 32, wrap this up, and then give my final kind of recap breakdown of things. So, verse 32, here we go. If the people bring a sheep as their sin offering, it must be a female with no defects. They must lay a hand on the head of the sin offering and slaughter it at the place where burnt offerings are slaughtered. Then the priest will dip his finger in the blood of the sin offering and put it on the horns of the altar for burnt offerings. He will pour out the rest of the blood at the base of the altar. Then he must remove all the sheep's fat, just as he does with the fat of a sheep presented as a peace offering. He will burn the fat on the altar on top of the special gifts presented to the Lord. Through this process, the priest will purify the people from their sin, making them right with the Lord, and they will be forgiven. I don't remember the whole on top of the special gifts phrase being there before. That, wonder why it specifies that? I guess maybe this was also supposed to be like if they were going to do their offerings for the day, this is kind of like the order in which they are to be done. Possibly. Anyway, so I assume that this last part means, a sin offering for the common people has options of both female goats or female sheep. Because, again, it says if they bring a sheep. So that seems to have options to it. Because, the common people of the community might not necessarily have a goat that is so readily available for such an offering. Maybe. It seems like a fair enough allowance. But otherwise, the procedure is exactly the same as the one with the goat. A female goat for the common people. So, yeah. That kinda does it. So, breakdown is high priest or whole community gotta be a young bull. There's the sprinkling 7 times in front of the inner curtain. And there's the burning of the rest of the animal at the special designated place outside the camp. But if it's just for one of the leaders, it's supposed to be a male goat. There is no sprinkling, inside the inner curtain, in front of the inner curtain. There's still the putting the blood on the horns and pouring the rest out at the altar, and the burning of the fat. But, there isn't some of those extra steps that there was for the high priests or the whole community. And then with common people sin offerings, there are options of sheep or goat, but in either case, it's a female. But aside from that, the process is similar to what it is for a sin offering for one of the leaders. if I'm remembering that all correctly. There might be a couple of minute differences in there, but generally speaking, that's how it all goes down. And there was your kind of, TLDR version of it, slash TLDW, I guess, since I'm, doing this as a video and whatnot. But anyway, so that wraps it up for Leviticus chapter 4. Alrighty, so that's going to do it for this one. Lots of info on the sin offerings, but, with sin being a fairly common thing for us flawed human beings, it makes sense that there would be a variety of ways, a variety of ability in particular to, have these sacrifices, make these offerings to God, and try to, atone for the sin that needs to be reconciled. All I can say is, I am glad this is something that we don't have to really worry about as Christians now. Because Jesus, yay. Anyway, okay, that's going to do it for now. As always, like and share if you enjoyed the video, subscribe and click the bell to get updates when I post new videos. Look down in the description for info on social media pages. And if you want to be part of these live streams, those are over on Twitch every Saturday, at least at the moment, starting around 4 p.m. Central Time. So yeah. Otherwise, if you have any other questions or want any other thoughts that you have connected to this, if you want me to see those, just leave comments down below. So anyway, that's going to do it for now. Hope you're all doing well. Hopefully I'll see you for the next one. But until then, stay cool, people.